Hi everyone, thanks a lot for watching this short video on AWS Session Policy. It took a while for me to understand what's the real purpose of this policy type and how to use it. So I thought of creating a very short video. In the subsequent video, you will see how within my own organization CyberArk, we have implemented this functionality in our privilege access management solution. So without further ado, let me kickstart my presentation. So this is the brief agenda I have put together. First of all, we will try to understand why this session policy came into existence and what it is. And then we will be deep diving into the policy evaluation logic and how this session policy being evaluated among other policies. So last but not the least, we will be showing the demonstration. In the demonstration, I have put together three different use cases, and I hopefully you will find this entire use cases demonstration very useful. So first, let's try to understand the why part. Why session policies came into existence. As we all know that it is not a good idea to use permanent credentials at all. And if attacker get hold of such credentials, then they can pretty much own your entire infrastructure considering the permissions attached to the primary or the permanent entity. So that's where temporary credentials has become so prevalent that within AWS, we all tend to use IAM roles as much as we can, starting from assigning the permissions to EC2 instances to access S3 buckets or all the way to the federated identity. So typically when it comes to the federated role, so most of the users always have the broad permissions. In contrast to the job, they really need to perform on a day-to-day basis. So one of the solution is we can keep on creating more and more number of IAM roles on the AWS side and map it on your IDP or identity provider. But again, if you think about it, it is going to become a daunting task. To solve all this challenge, so that's where session policy came to rescue. So let's see what is session policy. Okay, again, it is one of the advanced policy provided by AWS, and with the help of this particular policy, it can help you to limit the permissions of the user for a given session. So with the help of this specific policy, there is no need to create too many roles on the AWS side. And we can easily pass this policy while assuming the role within AWS. It can be via the CLI, via the APIs. And with the help of this, if you think about it, only the limited amount of permissions shall be granted to the user. So let's see in more detail. So first, let's try to understand the entire policy evaluation logic within AWS. Okay, within AWS, there are so many policies to be evaluated before the actual permissions being granted to any entity. Okay, for today's context and to focus more upon the session policy, we will focus upon last two permissions, session policy and identity policy only. But to put everything together, so this is how this entire policy categories in AWS is going to look like. So there are two different kind of a policies. The first kind of a policy in AWS, they call it guardrail. And another policy type is the grant policy. Guardrail, as the name suggests, so this policy type helps to limit the user's permissions or to limit the entity's permission. And its primary purpose is not to grant any kind of a permissions at all. So whereas whenever we talk about the grant policies are the one which really helps to grant the permissions to the entities. So when it comes to the session policy in specific, as you can see from my screen, session policy is more like a guardrail policy, and it can help to limit the overall user permissions. So let's see on the flow chart. So this is a very simple flow diagram. So here we will start with the assume role, and then while assuming the role, AWS is going to check, hey, whether this session policy is attached or not. If the answer is no, then user will be able to assume, or user will be granted all the permissions attached to the given role. But if the session policy is attached, user permission will be the common to both session policy and the role permission. It is more like an intersection. Let's look into it in a simplified manner. So here you will see the session policy correspond to all the permissions in the gray circle. So whereas role permissions are in the dark green. At the end, user shall be able to assume all the permissions granted to him in the light green color. So what it means, the permissions common to both session policy and the role permissions. So those permissions will be ultimately granted to the user. So let's look at two different scenarios. The first scenario is without the session policy. In the without the session policy, let's take an example. There are two different users. User A would like to perform read task only for a specific day or for at a given point of a time. Whereas user B wants to perform both read and write tasks. So despite the fact that both of these users, they would like to perform a very specific task. So what's going to happen? Whenever they are assuming a role, in this case, the role name is ABC. So both of these users in this specific case, so they will be granted read, write and delete permissions. So if you think it logically, so here we are not working upon the least privilege principle. So users are granted more like a broad permissions. So let's look at the scenario number 2. Scenario number 2 is with the session policy. Similar thing, user A wanted to perform read task and user B wanted to perform read and write task. So while assuming the role, what both of these users are going to do, they will send a session policy. User A is going to say, hey, I need to have read action only in the session policy. User B is going to say, hey, I need to perform only read write task only. In this example with the session policy, so user A will be granted only the read permissions only, whereas user B will be granted read and write permissions only. So in both cases, users are granted the minimum amount of privileges or the permissions they really require to perform their task. So now we are coming on to the interesting section. So now is the demo time. So for the entire demonstration, I have put together 3 different use cases. The first use case is very simple. So where a user wanted to perform a very simple task like a read operation only, but because there is no session policy involved, so user John, he can perform any read, write and delete action. So it means this user John is assuming a wider role, which is not a good security practice at all. In the second use case, so user John will be sending the read policy, will be sending the read in the session policy. And that's where user John will be able to assume a very specific read only permissions. And it means in this particular use case, we will see, so user John will be working upon the least privilege principle. The third one is a rogue user John, for example. He tried a slot to see whether he can be granted excessive privileges in case he tried to forward or he tried to pass on administrative permissions in the session policy. So these are the three different use cases. So we will be demonstrating. So let me bring up my Mobatum terminal. So give me a second. Okay, so now my Mobatum terminal is up. So here, let me show you. So what I have done previously. So I have already uh, created the credentials. Your created the credentials in the .aws directory. So here all my credentials and the config file is going to look like. Let me show you my config file. Okay, by default, I'll be communicating with the EUS3. I think it's the Paris region, but never mind. So what we will be doing, just to assume a role. So I will be running one of the command called AWS STMS assume role command, and we will be putting a session name as a S3 full access, and this is the role ARN or role what I'm going to assume as part of this particular role. So user shall be granted all the permissions for the S3 buckets. So let me run this particular command. Okay, I got this access key, secret access key. So what I will do, I will export three variables: your access key, secret access key, into the environment, and then we will be performing certain action on the S3 bucket to see whether everything looks okay or not. So it take a couple of seconds. So you can automate all these action as well. I just wanted to show you guys how to do it. So, so I think everything looks okay. So now let's try running one of the very simple command, and let's see whether this user has all the read permissions or not to list down all the buckets. Okay, so here you see this specific role has been given all the permissions to list down all the buckets. So let's try creating one of the bucket. Okay, let me copy this command. Let me clear it. Let me clear the screen. Let's try to create this bucket. Okay, so now if we see the bucket has been created, and let's see whether we can delete this bucket or not. Okay, so you are able to see we are able to delete the bucket as well. In short, so for the use case number one, if user is assuming this S3 full access role, in a way he's getting the broad kind of permissions. Okay, now we are going to jump into the use case number two. In the use case number two, we will be granting only the least amount of permissions to this particular user job. For this particular use case, I'll be using the remote machine number two, because uh, if I check on the environmental variable, you are able to see my secret access key, and already has been stored into this particular terminal. So I'll be going to the remote machine two. Before I go to the remote machine number two, what I have to do, I will go to my AWS site, and I will try to revoke all these temporary credentials. Okay, so I'm able to see, I will revoke this active session. Okay, once I'm able to revoke this active session, which I did in the background, if we try to run this command again, you are able to see, so this user don't have any permissions anymore. So for this particular terminal also, user has to assume the STS role again. Okay, now we are jumping onto the remote machine number two. Let me show you what I have done. So I have already pre-created a file name S3 read access. So let me open this JSON document. So here you are able to see. Uh, with the help of this session policy, users should be granted only the least amount of privileges or the permissions only. So let me run a command. So again, it's a long command. So here we are passing a extra variable. We are passing a policy minus minus dash dash policy and the file name. So once I run this command, so you are able to see I've been uh, given the temporary credentials again, and let me export all these credentials again. Key ID equal to export AWS secret access key, export AWS session token. Okay, now everything is set. Let's see whether this user can list down all the buckets or not. Let me run this command and you are able to see this. For this particular session, user is able to list down all the buckets. Okay, so let's try to see whether for this specific session we are able to create any new bucket or not. So here we are able to see access is denied. So it means this particular user has been granted a very least amount of permissions. So let me list down the buckets again, and then we will try deleting one of the buckets. So let's try deleting one of the bucket name pvwa cert. So here also we see the access has been denied. So in short, in the use case number 2, so with the help of the session policy, only the least amount of privileges or the permission has been granted for this particular session. So what I'll do in the background before we move to the use case number 3, I will revoke all the temporary sessions. So I have revoked, and let me run one of the command again to see whether it has been okay. So here we can see all the temporary credentials has been removed. For the use case number 3, so where user John, for example, he tries to act smart. He tries to think that if he is able to pass or pass the administrative privileges in the while assuming the role, can he have more number of excessive privileges? So here what we are trying to do, we are trying to pass the administrative privileges. So here if we see for this particular JSON policy, it is allowed to do anything at any kind of a resources. So for this particular session also, let me run one of the command. So here, okay. So here we are passing this policy administrator.json. So let me run this command and we are going to get a temporary credential again. So let me export all these temporary credentials. Access key ID, session key, code AWS session token. So it's done. So let's try to run one of the same command, whether this user, okay. I think I might, okay. So I have made some mistake. Let me export the secret access key again. Okay. So now everything looks okay. So let's run this command. Okay. So it means user is able to run the list command. Let's try to see whether user can create a bucket. User can create a bucket. Let's see whether user can delete a bucket. User can delete a bucket as well. Let's see, apart from the S3 full access, whether user has been granted any other permissions or not. As in the session policy, he forwarded the administrative privileges. Okay. Let's see, when user is trying to run a EC2 describe instances, what's going to happen? So here, if you see unauthorized operation, so this particular user or in this particular session, user John cannot list out, cannot perform any of the task apart from S3 full access. So that's what concludes all our video on the session policy, and thanks a lot for watching this video. See you guys some other time.